Well, I have the great honor and privilege to introduce to you tonight my husband, David Gerbel. He's going to, I don't know if he's going to break every chain, but he's going to try. David and I met through Match.com.
In a bar on Jacksboro Highway.
Thank you, David. This is what I live with every day. We met through Match.com. He tells people that we met through mutual friends, but that's okay. We actually met through Match.com. And next month is our 10th anniversary.
Oh, mine seems so pathetic.
Yeah, we made it through. We met in, I don't know, June or July of 2003.
June.
And we were married. What?
June. I remember.
June, whatever. And then we were married in about 8 or 9 months. Okay. And that's not very long. So I had a lot of friends to tell that hadn't met him. So I would say, yeah, I'm going to marry David Gerbel, and he is a former Baptist, Southern Baptist preacher. And they all went. And I said, yeah. And he's divorced, and he has 3 teenagers. And they all went, Catherine, no. But actually, his kids turned out to be very welcoming. He had been divorced for 12 years before he met me, so they didn't have any problem welcoming me into their family. He is a former Southern Baptist preacher, divorced. The church he was in, didn't really like it that he divorced, so he didn't go back into the ministry. He got a job at TCU. Go Frogs! And, right, I have to say that. So I met him, and he'd been at TCU for 10 years already. But it didn't take me long, really, to know that his heart and his whole identity really was still as a pastor. So I think that's really what you're going to hear tonight. So thank you. Let me ask you to welcome him for me.
It's kind of overwhelming. Both the introduction was very nice. Today we're you're getting dressed and you're getting ready to go to work and all, and she's saying, how do you want me to introduce you? And I'm saying, well, however you want to do it. And then she says, oh, I know how I'm going to do it. And I have been anxious the rest of the day, filled with fear over what this woman might say. So it turned out okay. It was good, dear. Thank you. Appreciate that. Although we met online. How pathetic is that? This is why I say we met in a bar. It sounds so much better. It's not true, but it sounds better. I am overwhelmed to be here tonight. Usually, the familiar place for me here is right where Todd is sitting. Todd is in my seat tonight, by the way. Keep it warm. I'll be back on Sunday. To stand up here is an incredible honor, because Cathedral of Hope is a place where God is doing some incredible things and some new things. It is a place, and Catherine laughed at me when I told her this. She says, it's not true. Just goes to show she doesn't understand Baptists. Cathedral is, from my perspective, the most authentically Baptist place I have ever been. Let me explain why. Historically, Baptists have always believed in soul freedom, in the opportunity to open arms and accept just anybody in. Now, sadly, Baptists, as we've grown up knowing them, forgot all of that. But historically, that's what Baptists were. And that's what you are. And so, if you'll allow me, tonight we'll all be honorary Baptists together. Of course, as a Baptist, it was kind of tough. By the way, Voices of Hope, I got to bring you guys to Fort Worth. Okay, you guys got to come to the agape meal. They'll know what to do with you. The neighbors who come to the agape meal love this kind of music. Me, I'm a Baptist. I don't know if you notice, I'm standing here like this. Part of it's out of sheer anxiety that my hands might all of a sudden get out of control and do something I'm not used to having them do. Broadway, I've been a member at Broadway for a little over 20 years. Broadway is a liturgical church, which is kind of funny for Baptists, and we wear liturgical garments when we preach, so I had to get out my liturgical garment for tonight. This is the apron that we wear at the agape meal, and it's the apron that I have worn for years. Well, not this precise one. I turn them in and get them cleaned occasionally, but it's the apron that I wear at the agape meal. The agape meal is a Thursday night community of worship that has been in existence since 1995. It's usually a gathering of about 200 people, members of Broadway, members of other local congregations, people from the community, homeless folks, folks who are economically distressed, all coming together around the table to share a meal, and then for those who choose to remain, share a time of worship together. Although the way we think about the agape meal is that the entire experience is worship. I don't tell them that because it probably ruins somebody's dessert. But as far as I'm concerned, the whole thing is communion. And the most wonderful thing that has happened to me, other than this lady here in the last few years, was when I was invited a few years ago to become the worship leader at the agape meal. And so on Thursday nights, a little before 6 o'clock, we gather. And as people come in, we greet them. We share words of gathering together where we explain what the agape meal is about and about why we're together like that. And then there are words that I always share with them that I'm sharing with you tonight because they're so meaningful to me. And they're so very true about my experience here this evening. There's no place I'd rather be than right here, right now, with each one of you. This is the place that God wants us tonight. Catherine will tell you that I read a lot. Well, actually, what she will tell you is that I'm obsessive about my reading. I think she's unfair. But nonetheless, I read a lot. Recently, I came across a history book, because that's typically what I read most of the time, entitled Bloodlands. Yes, it's just as ugly as the title implies. It's written by a historian by the name of Timothy Snyder, and it's about the genocide that occurred in Eastern Europe, committed by both the Nazis and the Stalinists. 9 million plus people dead because of what happened there. I don't want to talk about genocide tonight, but there's a quote in the book that really struck me when I read it. It's this: it's easy to sanctify the policies or identities by the deaths of the victims. It is less appealing, but morally more urgent, to understand the actions of the perpetrators. The moral danger, after all, is never that one might become a victim, but that one might be a perpetrator or a bystander. With that in mind, let me tell you a story. I want you to picture this. It was hot. It was muggy, sticky hot. The kind of hot that just drapes itself over you like a blanket that's been soaked in hot water and then thrown over your head. And the heat seemed to draw the mosquitoes by the millions. Mosquitoes were in their eyes and in their mouths and their noses, and the buzzing in their ears would have driven them crazy had they had time to pay attention. And it stank. The smell of the wet muck was a mix of salt and death and fear. They were stuck because they had been pursuing their former slaves, the Hebrews. But they weren't very concerned with the Hebrews at that very moment. Their focus was on the horses and on the chariots that seemed to be permanently embedded at the bottom of the sea. That was the surreal part about it. They were stuck in the mud at the bottom of the Red Sea. And the sea, with all of its angry noises, was coming back with a vengeance. They had only moments before the water would engulf them. The charioteers cracked their whips in a futile effort to force the chariots free. The air was filled with the screams and the prayers of men who knew that their lives were going to end in the next moments. And one of them, an ordinary soldier from a peasant family along the lower Nile, realized that in just a moment the water would close over his head, and he had one thought. Why? Why? He was a soldier in Pharaoh's army. How did he end up trapped in the muck at the bottom of the sea? He was a peasant boy who had struggled along with his family to stay alive from season to season. He had much more in common with the people he was pursuing than the Pharaoh who ordered him to pursue. He was conscripted into the army, as one of every 100 Egyptian peasants were, but he hoped to turn that conscription into the possibility of a better life for himself and his family, or if nothing else, at least make hunger less of a reality in their lives than it had been in the past. Soldier had nothing against the Hebrews. He'd grown up among them. He'd seen them working as slaves on the great public works projects in Memphis and other cities in Egypt. His mother had been a maid in a wealthy Egyptian family. She had worked with other Hebrew women. I suppose he could have said that some of his best friends were Hebrews. He had nothing personal against the Hebrews, but he wouldn't have lasted long in the army if that had gotten out. It was in his interests to go along. He didn't personally persecute Hebrews, mind you. He just kept his head down and did his job as a soldier. And honestly, isn't life better sometimes when you know that there's somebody else in the world who maybe is a little worse off than you are? Who maybe is a little lower in the pecking order than you find yourself to be? And now, he was trapped at the bottom of the sea. I believe it is important to identify with this soldier in Pharaoh's army, far more important than to identify with the masses fleeing from that army. Because like Snyder said, the moral danger is, after all, never that one might become a victim, but rather that one might become a perpetrator or a bystander. But why would a peasant soldier participate in acts that seem against his own best interests? Is it because he believed that holding somebody else down would enable him to somehow lift himself up? I don't know, but I suspect that may be the truth. Because I know that to some degree that has been the truth for me. It's confession time. I have been a soldier in Pharaoh's army. Catherine told you that I was an ordained Southern Baptist minister. I just love watching people's faces when we say things like that. They get really nervous. They don't know what he's going to do next. Oh my gosh, what's going to come out of his mouth? I never know either, by the way. Catherine definitely doesn't know, and it frightens her. The woman lives with anxiety constantly. Should I tell? Yeah, I need to tell this story. I think she's told some of you this story before. I was cutting up one night, giving her a hard time. She got really frustrated with me, and at that moment, I leaned over and I looked at her and I said, "Honey, just think, you waited 48 years for this." Well, kind of work with it. It'll come to you in a minute. Well, as a Southern Baptist minister in the 70s and 80s, I benefited from some opinions and positions that I said I was sort of uncomfortable with, but it was to my advantage to say little or nothing about. Because in my mind, I was one of the good guys. I spoke against racism, not real clearly from my own pulpit, mind you, but in other places. And I advocated for the greater participation of women in the life of the church, although when given the chance to do that with our deacons and our church council, I would find something else on the agenda to talk about. In the late 80s, I wanted to be a compassionate voice for those who were suffering from the horrifying impacts of HIV/AIDS. I was on the governor's task force in Northwest Georgia, the clergy task force, to talk about that issue. But in my church, I stood in the pulpit. And I made a choice to say something that I didn't believe was true, but I thought it was expedient. And so I told them that although we should be compassionate towards people with HIV/AIDS, we all know that homosexuality is a sin. I will spend the rest of my life asking God for forgiveness for that. I would creep up to the edge and then back away because I wasn't willing to do anything that might endanger my opportunity for advancement and my position. See, I was on track for advancement in the Georgia Baptist Convention, which sort of seems kind of small now, but at the time was pretty important to me. And so I would tell some of the other ministers, we need to ease up on some of this. We've got to create more space for people. But I wouldn't do that publicly because it wasn't to my advantage. And as I failed to challenge those ideas that held other people down, I found myself becoming small and narrow and ashamed. I was a coward. I was afraid of leaving Pharaoh's army, even though I knew that what the army was doing was wrong and that what I was doing was wrong. But I stayed because by staying, I thought there was some privilege, some benefit that would come to me by playing along. So what changed? Thinking of the song Voices of Hope sang earlier, in the name of Jesus. The Spirit sometimes does things we don't anticipate, and the Spirit chooses to do those things through people we don't anticipate it to happen through. There was a woman minister who was in a group that I would meet with regularly, and we would talk about minister types of things, and she was regularly calling me on my bull. Can I say that here? Maybe not. On my stuff, my bull stuff. She was relentless and made me uncomfortable, made me think. There was one of my dearest friends in the world, colleague at TCU, a lesbian who invited me to see beyond my very narrow ideas of love and commitment. There was a parishioner in my last church who would not allow me to force him into a pinched understanding of the grace of God, but instead showed me that the Spirit of God is alive and at work in places that are beyond my imagining. Believe it or not, he even convinced me that the Spirit might actually be moving outside of Baptist churches. Thank God for that. Life circumstances that caused a change in career. I was divorced. Moved to Texas with 3 small children. Tried to figure out what to do next. But life circumstances that led me to a loving wife who encourages me to be the decent person that most days I seem to be afraid to be. Thank you, dear. And a spirit of a loving God who reminds me that there is a way. It's embodied in an ancient hymn of the church found in the book of Philippians. You know this passage, let this mind be in you which was in Christ Jesus, who thought equality with God not something to be exploited, to be clung to, but emptied himself, took on the form of a slave, being born in human likeness, and being found in human form humbled himself and became obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. Christ did not consider equality with God something to be exploited, something to be clung to, but rather he let it go and Christ became all of us. It took a long time, and it will take a long time. But those words helped me learn that I can let go of the privilege that I think I deserve and receive in return something so much better. It sounds simple in some ways. That's what I like about being Baptist. You walk down the aisle on Sunday, you take the what was the phrase we used to use? The right hand of fellowship. Anybody remember that phrase? Take the right hand of fellowship. You ask Jesus to forgive you of your sins, and everything's good again. Well, that's a good start. But letting go has proven to be a lifetime journey. The members of the Agape Meal community continue to challenge the depth of my commitment to living with them as God's people. I find that even though I have been with them off and on for almost 20 years, that I still act in ways that are patronizing. I still have trouble hearing their voices through my filters, which know before they speak what they really mean to say. I experienced that a few weeks ago on a very, very, very cold Thursday night when a homeless African-American veteran got right in my face because we would not let him stay in the church that night. Now, I put on my reasonable and caring voice. You know the voice, the professional voice. And I said to him that the city had opened some additional shelters that night because it was so cold. And so he would not have to stay at the Presbyterian Night Shelter or try to get into the Union Gospel Mission because he didn't want to go there. But Bertha Collins was going to be open tonight, and the city was running shuttles. But if he'd like, I'd be happy to take him down to the shelter tonight. You know what he said? How can you tell me to stay in a shelter? You've never been in a shelter in your entire life. You don't have any idea what they're like. Well, sir, just don't talk to me. And he gathered up his stuff. I remember he had this big old guitar or something out of case. He put it on his back and he picked up his bags and he headed for the door, and I'm standing there with this, what do I say next, look on my face, and he looks back over his shoulder and he throws back at me these words, "You don't care if we die out there." Okay, that really PO'd me. How dare he? We weren't going to let him die in the cold. I offered to take him to the shelter tonight. We had fed him tonight. We had fed him many nights. I'm one of the good guys. How dare he say? And yet he did. He challenged my sense, my identity, my capacity to identify with him. And when he did that, he put me right back in Pharaoh's army. And you know what? He was right. I was trying to give him my answers, and I wasn't hearing whatever was in his voice, the fear, the anger. I don't know, that was there, so many other things there. I'm still on a journey out. When I first married Catherine, after we met in that bar on Jacksboro Highway, she was the interim minister to the Disciples of Christ congregation. They obviously didn't know about her social life. And that congregation would have communion every Sunday. Now, I was raised a Baptist. We were pretty progressive Baptists. We didn't have communion just once a quarter. We had it once a month, on the first Sunday of every month. And so I thought, communion every Sunday, doesn't that get kind of routine? I mean, that just doesn't seem right to me. And I was afraid we'd get in there and it just, my mind would wander. My mind never wanders here, but my mind would wander there, and communion would just be sort of rote, and I want communion all the time. I love coming to worship and sharing the bread and the cup. So much so, we do it every Thursday night at the Agape Meal. Don't tell the deacons at Broadway. They don't know that. I don't want them to know that yet. But I love that. And so I loved it when we came here that first Sunday in April of 2013? 2012. 2012. Wow. That's cool. It's been almost 2 years now. And sat right there where Todd and Paul are. And we're invited up for communion. And I thought, this is just the coolest thing. So we came up and we took communion. I remember Shelley was standing there. I went to Shelley. I didn't know her, but it was wonderful. We sat back down, and I'm just experiencing communion at Cathedral of Hope. And I just broke down. I just broke down. Because what I was seeing in front of me were these incredibly beautiful people of God who were coming and sharing this wonderful act of being together. And as I share in that Sunday after Sunday here, I began to realize that I was seeing something else. Every time we come down this aisle and go in these different directions or down these side aisles, and we come to someone and we receive the bread and we receive the cup, we are becoming God's people who are turning their backs on Egypt and turning their faces to the promised land. In the act of communion at Cathedral of Hope, all of you become the gospel for one another. All of you in communion, for me, open a richer, more authentic communion that is based on love. In the act of communion in this church, you invite a soldier in Pharaoh's army. Get up and come with you to the promised land. I want you to imagine a different ending to our earlier story. There's still the mud, there's still the noise, there's still the fear that you can smell and taste. But as our soldier looks up, he doesn't notice so much the waters beginning to come back in. What he notices are the people on the far shore. And they haven't turned their backs on him. They aren't mocking his impending death. They're waving to him, not goodbye, but rather, come on, come on. They're extending to him the invitation to escape the mud and join God's people on the way to the promised land. I imagine him frozen for a moment in his steps, uncertain what to do next, looking here at the chariots that represent the life that he'd chosen, the life that he thought might have some benefit for him, and then looking over there at the shore, a life that offers for him a future. And then he looks into his hands, sees the weapons, the axes and the spears that he's carrying, and he drops them. And he slowly begins to move as the mud grips at his feet. And then he tries to run. And like in those dreams where you just can't move fast enough, he's not sure he's going to make it. And he struggles to reach the shore before the waters close over him. And as he feels that water coming up on him, he feels also hands reaching down and grabbing him, pulling him up. And as he spits the mud from his mouth and wipes the water from his eyes, he looks around. Not just at the Hebrews who called him to salvation, but also to all of the others, soldiers like him, who have been saved from Pharaoh's army. He has a long journey with those people ahead of him, 40 years yet, fraught with dangers, the greatest of which for him will be the temptation to go back. But he will be on this journey with God's people, all of them bound together for the beloved community in God's promised land. We are bound for the promised land. Oh, who will come and go with us? We are bound for the promised land.